chapter 16 talks about basal ganglia, and the subtitle is Motor and Psychologic Functions, which I think is pretty interesting. So, as I'm sure you've heard me say before, I work in a Parkinson's specialty program called LSVT Big, and I do a lot of extracurricular activities having to do with Parkinson's. And the really interesting thing about Parkinson's is its effect on the basal ganglia, the treatments you can do for it, and then the fact that it has motor and non-motor effects. So a lot of times Parkinson's is classified as a motor disorder because its motor effects are the most obvious, but it has a lot of non-motor effects too, and that's because of all the functions that are done by the basal ganglia. So lots and lots of great detailed information in this chapter. We're going to keep it simple again, like we did with the cerebellum, a little bit more on Parkinson's and Parkinson's syndromes, mostly because we treat them a lot in physical therapy. So the learning objectives also very simple, just like chapter 15. What are the major roles of the basal ganglia? I want you to be able to describe the signs, symptoms, pathology, and etiology of Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease. I want you to be able to list and describe the three fundamental types of movement. So we will discuss those all. So this is a little bit on the anatomical orientation to the basal ganglia. So I don't expect you to know all the basal ganglia structures and everything, but I just consider this sort of like an introduction to them. I'm not going to test you on them, but it's just sort of giving you some orientation. So the basal ganglia, really what they do, and a ganglion is a group of related neurons. It's a group of neurons with related function. So the basal ganglia is the plural, and so it's several groups of related neurons that do a lot for us. So really the primary job of the basal ganglia is to predict the effects of various actions and then to make and execute action plans. Wow, that's pretty deep, right? So we're going to explore that a little bit. But so each nuclei is part of the basal ganglia. There are lots of different ones, and it's pretty much located in the middle of our brain. So as part of the diencephalon. So basal ganglia are involved in psychological functions of goal-directed behavior, social behavior, and emotions, as well as motor control. And motor control is what it's most famous for, but it also has all those other functions. So both the basal ganglia and the cerebellum adjust activity in descending motor tracts, despite the fact that they do not have any direct connections with motor neurons. So the basal ganglia and the cerebellum influence movement via different pathways through the thalamus and to motor areas of the cerebral cortex in connections with the upper motor neurons in the motor tracts. So the basal ganglia predict the effects of various actions and then select and execute actions largely by inhibiting competing motor actions that would otherwise interfere with the desired movement. So it's not just a matter of choosing movements and doing them, it's inhibiting the movements that you don't want. So basal ganglia turn off some motor programs and turn on others, which is really interesting. It's very complex, the way that they work. And just as we find out more and more of them, it is just more and more interesting, to me anyway. Hopefully you share a little bit of my interest. So talking about just the anatomy of the basal ganglia, the basal ganglia nuclei are located in or near the base of the cerebral hemispheres. That's where the name basal comes from. It's at the base of the cerebral hemispheres. So there are all these different nuclei. The caudate is located in the cerebrum. It's part of the cerebrum. The putamen is located in the cerebrum. The globus pallidus, cerebrum. The subthalamic nucleus, or STN, is located within the diencephalon, which that's the thalamus and that area right in the center of the brain. The substantia nigra is located within the midbrain, and I have a picture of those coming up. So, based on anatomic proximity, the cerebral basal ganglia have joint names, like names that join two of them together. The lentiform nucleus is the globus pallidus and the putamen together. The striatum is the caudate and the putamen together. The ventral striatum is the junction of the caudate and the putamen. And the nucleus accumbens is part of the ventral striatum. Do you need to know that for the exam? No, you do not. But just really sort of giving you a vocabulary to deal with the basal ganglia. This is a picture from page 303 on the book. And there's the next part of the diagram right underneath it. It's just such a beautiful structure. I think it's amazing that that is right there in the middle of our brains doing all that for us. Of course, the structures in the book, they do them different colors to differentiate between the different areas. So I don't think it's probably really, well, in fact, in all the brains I've seen, it's not really this color in real life. But there are some of the things that actually do have color. The substantia nigra, which is the area where the dopaminergic cells exist, it's substantia nigra, which means dark substance or black substance. There's an area called the locus ceruleus, which means blue area. And then we have the red nucleus. So there are areas in the brain that do have a little bit of color, but I really don't think they're as colorful as these pictures. The basal ganglia, the cortical motor areas of the basal ganglia produce excitation of the striatum by delivering the transmitter glutamate. And we know that glutamate is the primary excitatory neurotransmitter in the central nervous system. Dopamine from the substantia nigra to the striatum adjusts the signals to the output nuclei. The output nuclei provide the appropriate level of inhibition to their target nuclei. So we're going to start talking about the idea of inhibition versus disinhibition. And disinhibition is sort of like a double negative. It's inhibited and then it's disinhibited. So we'll try to get our heads around the idea of disinhibition. So this is a little cross-section of the cerebrum, the midbrain area. The little dark parts up the top, that's part of the cerebral spinal fluid openings. We'll talk more about those in the chapter regarding those. Right at the bottom, that little, like almost little mustache of dark cells, the substantia nigra, that is where the dopaminergic neurons live, the ones that are creating all the dopamine for the brain. So in a person with Parkinson's, those have died off. By the time that someone has symptoms of Parkinson's, 80% of their substantia nigra neurons have died off. And you can't tell that in a living person. You have to do it in a cadaver brain. But there's a picture in chapter 2 of the brain where you can see the substantia nigra, and then another brain where those cells are missing, and it's light in there. It's not dark anymore. So the output of the basal ganglia motor circuit regulates muscle contraction, muscle force, multi-joint movements, and the sequence of movements. It includes cerebral cortex motor areas, the putamen, the subthalamic nucleus, the globus pallidus, and motor areas of the thalamus. The basal ganglia are involved in decision-making, judgment, prioritizing information, emotional processing and responses, learning, eye movement, spatial attention, and motor output. So all that and motor output. So lots of things going through the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia has profound effect on movement, but it has no direct output to the motor neurons. Stimulation of the pedunculopontine nucleus, or the PPN, regulates contraction of postural and girdle muscles via the lateral reticulospinal neurons. Stimulation of the MLR elicits rhythmical lower limb movement similar to walking or running. So part of our movement patterning has to do with things that go on in the basal ganglia. Part of our posture and standing have to do with basal ganglia circuits. So you can see why walking and posture are things that are affected when you have basal ganglia dysfunction. Basal ganglia involvement in non-motor functions occurs through 3 corticobasal ganglia thalamic circuits. And the circuits in the basal ganglia are usually referred to as loops. So we have the motor loop, we have a goal-directed behavior loop, a social behavior loop, an emotion loop, and the loops contribute to the prediction of future events, selecting desired behaviors, preventing undesired behaviors, motor learning, shifting attention, and spatial working memory. We'll talk about each one of those loops and what they do.